And it's another Friday. I'm loving these Fridays.
Yes, it is nice, isn't it, Merv? It's cold and blustery today, but still, it's pleasant. And I always look forward to sitting down, right after my brunch and having a good conversation with you.
No, it is. I don't know why we call it coffee hour, but I guess it's kind of a coffee. I'm going to have to start bringing my coffee to this hour because usually I'm an early riser. So I usually have my first 4 cups before 10 a.m. So no, but it's good stuff. It's all good stuff.
So now we're talking this week about contracts and contracting, which is going to be very interesting because of your role and the types of projects you have. I bet you have a lot of experience that many of our listeners don't have on this. What's your take on that?
I do have a lot of experience, both good and actually mostly good. Some somewhat negative, but I think the whole nature of contracting is to keep us on the straight and narrow, to make sure that we as IT professionals and our customers get what we bargained for. So contracts, in my mind, are an absolutely necessary plus to any project.
Wow.
The issue, of course, is that a lot of project managers, especially when they're starting out, don't really think about the fact that contracts affect them. And I want to talk about that a little later on. It's sort of like, I want to manage a project. I don't want to manage contracts, right?
But the problem is, whether we're buyers, sellers, or both, they're out there. And what I've learned over time was that it's sort of like going to court, not like court in legal court, but royal court. And they have these dances and procedures. And since everything has to be documented and is so important and critical, we have these very specific steps that we have to do at the very specific time in order to reflect what, the respect we have for the process, but also the respect we have for what we're doing for others.
Well, exactly. And in my situation, my whole experience with contracting started off as a very young person to the whole idea of being on a project. But as I kind of worked in my career and understood more and more, eventually I went over from the system integration side to supporting and advising the customer side of a contract side. So if you let me kind of tell a little story, I just kind of get us started with an experience I had, we'll just say in the last decade. How's that?
That's great.
But what was interesting was contracts don't start with signing the signature line on a contract document. In the kinds of work that I've done as a system integrator, the contracting process actually started with the procurement process. Mm-hmm. And I was brought in at one time to do some advisory work. It was a 4-year project, but it was advisory work that started with creating the procurement vehicle to which system integrators would bid, and the successful bidder would then become the company that we end up overseeing. And in this one situation, when I got called in, I literally got off an airplane, drove to the client site, and was immediately provided with a request for proposal that they were about to put onto the street. They had sent me a copy early on, and while I was on the airplane, I'd gone through it. I came in, and the very first act in my first 5 minutes on the project was to provide advisory services on the procurement vehicle. And they looked at me expectantly, very pridefully in terms of their the work they'd done on this RFP. And I said, well, if you want me to sort of give you my version of a blessing, I can't. In fact, I would sit down and rewrite this entire contract from the perspective of you wanting to get a credible system integrator, because some of the rules and definitions and aspects of this contract will not invite some of the credible system integrators into your project. they will shun this contract because it's too onerous in some of the terms. You should have seen the looks on their faces, Tim, when I said that, because they were expecting that it would go on the street the next day. So it's an interesting thing. That was the procurement vehicle prior to the contract vehicle. And I think when we talk about this today, we're going to talk about both contracts and procurements because they go hand in hand.
Yeah, let's start off with talking about procurement and what that word is and what it represents. What's your take on that?
I feel like I've been talking a lot already, so I'm going to give you a real quick definition and then I want to hear yours. Let's take it personally. If I'm going to be hiring someone to paint my house, I'm going to go out on the street and ask for at least 3 bids and compare what they're going to give to me for the money that they're going to charge me and then make my selection from that. So something as simple as that, from a personal perspective, is an act of procurement. What about yourself? What are you thinking on this in this area?
If you study the term in school, procurement has to do with purchasing, full stop. So it's even going to the store and buying the paint. That's a procurement. The contract, when you're buying paint, the contract is the receipt that you receive from the store owner that what represents, here's the paint and here's the money and here's the exchange. And it also has a commitment to it. And we'll talk about that in a bit. So a procurement is a purchase, whether it's purchasing, people doing work for you, the service, or whether it's a product you're buying. And it doesn't matter if it's off the shelf or somebody's developing it for you, it's still a purchase.
It could be a license that you don't even own the product, but it could be procuring a license that gives you permission to use that product to do your particular system integration work. So yeah, it does come down to that. What's interesting to me, and what may be interesting to some of the folks that are listening to us right now, there's all sorts of thoughts around procurement. And one of the ones, when the example I had given, or the story that I had just given, we decided in that situation that we would not look for lowest price or best price, but we would look for best value. And so that is an entirely different kind of slant on procurement, because you're looking not just at price, but you're also looking at what you're getting for that price. So there's all sorts of different vehicles, even in the procurement world.
Yes. Oh, indeed. Indeed. A contract, on the other hand, represents a purchase, but it represents a purchase usually between 2 entities, businesses, for the most part. And how do you see a contract as standing out against procurement?
Well, procurement is the vehicle by which you, as a buyer, by which you procure goods or services, or goods and services.
Mm-hmm.
The contract is that document or that vehicle that seals the deal. This is what we agreed on for price. This is what we agreed on for performance. This is what we agreed on for quality. And it's written down so that we can kind of lock in what we, as 2 different bodies, buyer and seller, agreed upon. And so then it's put into writing, basically. Yeah.
If you look at the formal definition, it has really interesting components. And if you put all the components together, it starts making sense. So you have that commitment and obligation. You have that coverage by law, because there's a bunch of contract law that you have to follow. And that's what creates that commitment and obligation. And then you have a relationship with an exchange. And the exchange is usually something like a deliverable, with something in return for fair value, which is equal value. And I like the name fair. It's not lowest payment, but it's fair value. Yeah. And so we have that relationship, we have that exchange, and we have that commitment and obligation. And that's what creates that contract.
And so many people, and I think we'll discuss this a little bit later, but so many, I'll say people, project managers especially, kind of look at contracts as a negative. But I'll tell you what, I've been in situations where, let's say, the people who negotiated the contract ended up perhaps going on to another corporation. If that had not been written down in detail, all of that knowledge would have been lost. And then you'd have been kind of hanging in there saying, well, what was promised? What was going to be delivered? So you want something in writing anyway, because human memory is awfully, awfully short in many ways.
Let's actually look at this from a pragmatic standpoint. It represents discipline. It represents here's what we will do and what we won't do. It defines that boundaries. It's sort of like the fence around the work of the contract, right? Now, we always think of a fence as keeping us in and limiting us, and that's just human behavior. We're selfish. But when in fact, when a farmer puts a fence around a farm, they're not necessarily limiting the lives of their livestock or their family. They're actually protecting the livestock and the family from what's out in the great wide world. We forget that discipline creates that nice little bubble of safety within which we can do really good work. And so when you look at it that way, contracts make a lot more sense.
Well, exactly, because the contract seals the deal. It sets the parameters under which both the buyer and the seller will perform. A lot of people forget that. I've been on the side of the buyer when they have huge expectations of what the seller will do and forget their own obligations. But a contract obligates both parties to be able to perform under that vehicle.
Yeah, and I've been the buyer who provides the fair value when I outsourced either the whole project or part of my project. And I've also been the seller as a contractor and it's fascinating to see this from both sides. And yes, you can take it shiny side down where it'll limit you and it constrains you, but you can also take it as shiny side up where if you do a really good job at defining what's in the contract, it establishes trust. And this is what I think about all the time, because as human beings, we take time and build relationships, and relationships under time is how we establish that trust. Contracts are the way two companies can establish that amount of trust quickly.
Well, and this may sound oxymoronic, but the best contracts that I have ever worked under are ones which I never referred to again after they were signed. You've probably heard the term, I pulled contract. The minute you have to do that, that means something in the trust or something in the relationship has broken or has at least gone off the rails a little bit.
It's sort of like you have a plan and you have a planning. And the plan is the thing. It's the result of the planning. But the focus is the process of developing the plan. And if you focus on the process of developing, it sort of is what is almost more important than the plan itself. And I hate to say this, but the development and the creation and the debate and the negotiation that go into the contract is almost more important than the terms of the contract itself.
It's been a little while, but I was recently on a project where within, I think, 3 months of a 2-year contract, the system integrator pulled contract. And when I say that, they sent an email to my customer, to the buyer, saying that based on this clause, and this clause, we believe that your obligations are not being met, or however they happen to phrase it. And so I spoke to the contract administrator, actually the project manager, the director from the buyer side, and we looked at that and we said, if they're pulling contract this early in the project, this is not going to go well. So rather than send back an email with the argument against what they said, we sent back an email that was nicely worded, but just basically said, come on, we're in this 2 months. Let's work through this without having to resort to contractual language to prove our points. And we managed to get through that fairly quickly. But, if the other side, the buyer side, had immediately looked at their side of the contract, and then it would have been at odds immediately. And what suffers is the project.
Exactly. And you know, if you think it takes weeks to months to put up a good contract and to build that relationship through that document, you know, there's a lot of investment there. And you're right, it's ludicrous to allow these small deviations to forget that there's something at the end of the contract that you both desire.
Well, and I've been also on the system integrator side actually a lot longer than I have been on the buyer side or the customer side. And there were some procurements we spent almost a year working on. Now, we typically would still counteract those costs of personnel working on the proposals by having them also work on projects. But that's still, the opportunity cost of people giving up nights and weekends for a year to get a procurement completed and a contract signed. You're right, that is an expensive ordeal. And sometimes it's at the cost of solid people.
This is one of the things we think about if we're approving projects, even back in the project charter place. What you're looking at is two things when you're considering a project in this area. Number one, do I want to go through the pain of contracting? Am I getting something in return? What are the benefits for the time and the money and the sweat equity cost? And number two, how does this benefit the result in the long term itself against, the value of the deliverable? And this is something that we don't take lightly, especially when we're looking at critical projects. A lot of consideration has to go into this.
Well, and I think that's also why I kind of started off some of the conversation with this particular podcast, was that a lot of times we as project managers, we sit there and we rub our hands because we're ready to manage the project. And we forget about the fact that the project starts with procurement, contracting, and then there's a statement of work that we have to adhere to. And we as project managers often forget the statement of work that we have to adhere to. And so I think that's why this particular conversation you and I are having is going to be beneficial to those who are listening, because it's such an important part of what we do in IT.
So that's one of my other questions. That's one of my other questions I had for you. Are there any situations when you have enough trust between two entities that you can have like an oral contract, or do they need to be on paper?
I would say no. I would say always put it on paper. And it's not even the trust factor, the relationship factor. I've had some clients that I had such a stellar relationship with. We would go to battle for each other, but I would still put it in writing because memory is fallible. People change. CEOs are taken out, new CEOs come in. All sorts of things can happen, and it's nice to have that original understanding, the original discussion, the original negotiation points that are all outlined in the form of a written piece of paper.
If you agree, but you're not willing to put it on paper, what does that say? Right. That's and I hate to be so crass, but it's common sense. What does putting thing on paper do? It creates evidence and it maintains version control, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're not willing to do that, number one, what's your integrity? Number two, what's keeping you from doing that? What are the details? And that needs to be explored before you start going down the process of developing that contract.
Yeah, that's so important. But let me ask you, you and I have been at this for a long time. So can you think back far enough for your first experience with contracts and projects?
Yeah.
Can? Because I was scratching my head to see if I could remember.
Yeah, I remember I was a IT director back in 1995. I'd gone to enough business school. I know the mechanism, but I was at the state level. And so there were laws that actually governed how we were going to negotiate and that kind of thing. like what you said earlier in the show, we don't just look at fair value. We have to have a huge list of items where the price is only one component that we evaluate. And so here I was an IT director, and I was thinking, am I spending too much time thinking about this? And I'm putting my budget together. Well, the thing is that one of the first efforts I had was I was building these contracts as part of my next year's budget. And so even before the contracts were approved, I had to go up in front of state committees and defend my budget. And so I was so thankful that I had spent the effort in crafting these contracts a little early so that I really understood, number one, what we were going to do, and number two, why the costs were what they were.
Yeah, I wish I could say that mine was as noble as that, but my first experience was one that came out of complete naivety. And I was an analyst, actually probably a senior analyst on a project, and actually in charge of the user acceptance and the preparation for implementation. And my vice president came to me and said, "Okay, so we've got a major presentation to our customer in 2 weeks in terms of the completion of the training materials." And I said, "Oh, we're not going to be ready in 2 weeks. There's no way. We can't. It's not going to happen." And he said, "No, it's going to happen. We have a contract." And I said, "But we're not done." He said, "No, you're not understanding. We have a contract. We have to have it done in 2 weeks." And I said, "Okay, then if you can bring me 2 more analysts, we can get this done probably in time." He said, "First of all, there's no such word as probably. And secondly, there's no budget for 2 more analysts. So how are you going to get it done in the next 2 weeks?" That was a learning experience that kicked my butt. That never happened to me again after that. But I had gone in very naively as an IT person, as an analyst, as a senior analyst, thinking I've got this body of work to get done and I'm going to get it's going to be a good job, not paying attention to timelines or contractual language. So like I said.
Yeah. And again, you go through that 3 or 4 times and you learn the difference between the definition of hope and the definition of confidence. Confidence is not hope. It's having an analytical estimate, a very high probability that this will occur, and you understand the risks that could modify the outcome.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing I learned from that, besides the fact that there is something called a sacred contract, my boss was not about to write a change request whereby we end up coughing up penalty monies. But the other thing I learned was, you know what? My perfection is not even noticed by my client. Had I just done a good job, the client would have been ecstatic and I would have been done on time without a lot of overtime. So it's, it's a huge learning experience the whole time. In this case, a contract taught me how to manage my time better.
Yes, indeed it did. Now, here's a question for you. We talk about how these contracts structure and they define very crisply. Have you ever seen contracts limit your ability to manage projects? And how did you deal with that?
Well, that's a tough one. I don't know that I've ever had one that's limited. Maybe a better word would be, for my experience, would be governed. Yeah. Because, limit says there's some things that I'd like to do for my client, but I can't.
Right.
Whereas governed sort of talk to me anyway, it's almost like you've got a street bike that you put a governor on so that you don't break the speed limit in residential areas. That doesn't limit you from riding your bike, but it does protect you from making some serious mistakes. Or that may be a stupid analogy, but if I look at it from that perspective, I don't think it's limiting so much.
I like the term you use, governed. I was about to say it would change my approach to the work.
Yeah.
instead of thinking about how it, keeps me from doing my work.
Well, and I think, in fact, let me go back to your original question in terms of using the word limiting. I think it can also be enabling. I think a contract can be, it may limit you in terms of unacceptable behavior, but the clauses that are put in negotiation and in agreement can also enable you. So for example, if I, as the system integrator, notice that your subject matter experts are asking additional requirements of me that I did not sign up for, the contract allows me to ask for a change request to bring on more people perhaps and do that. So in that case, it enables me to do the work that is above and beyond what the original contract specified. So I think there's a number of ways to look at this, but I always look at contracts as my friend.
Yes. And from the very beginning to when the contract's closed, its whole intent, and this is what I've found, it is of a benefit, which is define, understand, and work within the precise agreement as to what we're going to have. And if that needs to be changed, there's a mechanism on how we formally change it. Now, we get in trouble when we become complacent and we forget that there is this formal process that we've agreed to.
No, that's exactly right. So when I say that, when I said earlier in terms of the contract, the best contract is one that I never have to look at again. That's not to say that I don't extract the statement of work and make sure that my schedule and my quality and my deliverables adhere to that statement of work. I mean, that's what governs the entire end product, is that statement of work.
If you have met somebody who's never worked under a contract as a buyer or seller, we've given a lot of advice, but how would you advise them to start understanding contracts and mechanisms and that kind of thing? How would you tell them to go about learning this part of project management?
I would go back to that statement of work, and I've done this with staff on my projects, where I've given them, and again, a contract might be 600 pages. The statement of work may be 50 of those 600 pages. I'm just making up some numbers, but I would extract that statement of work, and I would have my staff, my delivery staff, read through that entire statement of work, and then also hold some, perhaps after hours discussions on what it is that we're obligated to do and what it is that we expect our customer to help in their obligations. So that's where I would start, is with the statement of work, having them understand it, having them not memorize it, but know it, so that as we progress, that's always in the back of our minds.
Yeah, so and referring back to it and commenting that, this is something that, our side of the contract have committed to. And if we need to change it, being proactive with a contract is really helpful. Yeah. One of the things that I observed that got me into trouble a couple times was when I have a change that is approved on my side of the contract. Like, here I am, a buyer, right? And somebody's doing the work. They're not going to make a change to that work unless they ask us for permission or ask for a change. But as a buyer, the work that the seller is doing for me is a subset of all my work. And if I change a piece of my work, it's on my shoulders to take that change and compare to my contract to see how it breaks it. And that's where I've gotten in trouble a lot.
I used an example a few podcasts ago in terms of, we're doing a large project in the health and human services arena when the Affordable Care Act was passed. And actually, a lot of the rules that we had already worked on, designed, and started coding suddenly were turned on end because of the new rules from the Affordable Care Act. And so that's a situation where I, as the buyer, I was advising the buyer, was changing the rules on the system integrator, on the seller who had bid to a certain set of requirements. So yeah, that's a perfect example of where we now have to, I think you used the term break the contract. We didn't break the contract, but we certainly went through another round of negotiations and had to walk that tightrope of keeping staff working while we figured out the elements of what change was.
Yeah, and yes, you go through that once, just unaware that it's happening, and then from then on, you catch those things and you monitor them, and you you make those proactive adjustments so that it doesn't disrupt what you're doing.
So and you had asked the question in terms of if I was new and what should I watch out for in terms of contracts. This may be a good jumping off point as well. I mentioned the system, the statement of work, but I think there's also something that if I really want to become a project manager, let's say I'm a team lead and want to become a project manager, let's say I'm a neophyte project manager, want to become better at my job. The other thing is ask a lot of questions. So when you see a change in your schedule, for example, say, how could we make this change? Or when we made this change, why did we have to go to the change control board that's governed by the client, by the customer? So there's also that element of asking a lot of questions within the confines of the statement of work so that we understand what's happening.
That's what was surprised me in consulting. When I went into consulting, all of a sudden I was in the seller side, and I was thinking, am I going to have to do this alone? And the answer was no. I had 1, 2, or 3 finance experts, and they were going to help me with the exchange. I have my purchasing agent who helped me administer and manage the processing of the contract. And then I had my attorney. I had entire staff who was actually helping me. And then, I had sales and a couple other headcount that were actually making sure, as a consultant, nothing got in my way to move things forward. And so it was like, for the first 6 months, I was taking somebody to lunch and picking their brains, whether it was finance or legal or purchasing, so that I could really understand from their perspective what drove contracts and what made good and bad contracts.
So you've participated on both sides of the contract vehicle, both as buyer and seller?
Mm-hmm.
What did that look like for you on either side?
Well, I thought being a buyer, I was going to be heavy-handed and overbearing and tell the seller exactly what I was going to do. I found out that the sellers were smarter than me. That was the first thing, okay? The second thing, as a seller, I realized that if I understand the buyer's role, I could help the buyer make better decisions. And I could actually advise the buyer before that paper got signed. And so this led me to that whole concept that we talked about earlier today about relationships, and how keeping open, solid, and growing relationships can only make contracting, and we know about projects better, but it can actually make contracts and contracting better too.
Yeah. Going back to my opening story, where within the first 5 minutes of being on project site, they wanted my opinion, or I shouldn't say opinion, my valued wisdom, let's put it that way, in terms of what to do with the request for proposal that they were about to put on the street. And when I said I would not do that, I would rewrite this particular procurement vehicle. Part of that came from the fact that they had onerous clauses in that client, such that if you wanted a very large system integrator to be able to bid on that job, they would shy away because the liability to their shareholders was far too great. So they were about to attract a bunch of, and these are fine companies, but I'll call them mom and pop shops, where if they lost out on the project and that particular clause bankrupted them, they didn't have as much to lose as these large system integrators. And so for them to be able to attract small companies who probably would not be able to perform was not in their best interest. It would have wasted a lot of time in terms of the procurement process, the contracting process, and the delivery process that would not go well. So when they understood why I said rewrite it, they suddenly understood that the clauses that they had in there were exactly those kinds of things that pushed credible sellers away from them.
You only get that through observation and experience of multiple iterations. And that's where relying on the mentors and the experts around you is a necessity in this area.
Well, and I think the credibility that I was able to lend to the process was the fact that I had come from the large system integration field of, I'd worked for a couple of very large companies that were in this business. And I said, if I were working for those companies today, we would not be bidding this.
Right.
And jaws dropped all around that conference room table. So it was, but again, it was because I had seen it from the other side that I was able to advise them on this side, and they did rewrite the procurement. And we did get a very solid system integrator bidding, actually two very solid system integrators sparring off against each other, and ended up doing very well in that project.
Very good. Very good. So it sounds like we're starting to wrap up our discussion here. Are there any final words that you can think about as advice or clarification, or just a general statement about procurement and contracts and the role they are in project managers and what project managers need to think about them?
Well, not so much words of wisdom or anything, but I have a question for you. Way early on in this podcast, I talked about different vehicles for procurement that ended up with different vehicles for contracting. But one of my favorite was time and materials. But that was also, when I was on the buyer side, harder to administer because you weren't sure when always you were going to get that product, because it was time and materials. I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of time and materials versus fixed price, fixed schedule.
So this is where both knowledge and experience need to guide you. And this is where, a good attorney and purchasing agent can help you. So there's three types of contracts, right? We have fixed contracts, cost contracts, and time and material. And let's go through those really quickly. In a fixed contract, you know the work. It's laid out, and the actual price of the contract is declared in the contract, and it's a commitment and obligation. The buyer's not at risk of any cost increases. It's all on the seller. And so the work is well known, so the seller does not need a lot of advice. And you're exactly right. Cost contracts actually fulfill a real big need under contracting. It's where the buyer negotiates for reimbursement because the work is a little loosey-goosey. We don't know, I know I need you because you build fences, but I don't know what type of a fence, and I don't know how big. So can we get you under a reimbursement? And here's the profit that goes along with that reimbursement.
So they build the profit in that case, right? It's basically
it is a separate term called a fee.
A fee,
and if you want to, in future shows, we can talk about the different fee structures in cost contracts, because there's a fixed amount sometimes where you don't want the risk to impact the profit of the seller. There's a scaled fee, there's a target fee, there's incentive and award fees. So you have a lot of flexibility in negotiating the profit structure based on the work, based on the quality, as well as based on the relationship.
Yeah.
Now, with a time and material, you're augmenting your staff, but it's only a temporary augmentation. It's not like adding an FTE or headcount. What you're doing is you're having somebody come in for a short time as an expert. They come into your team, they help you, and when their work is done, they're gone. Now, a cost contract still says, you're doing this work, it's going to help me, but when we have time and material, here I am with my project, you're coming in and helping in this way. So that's the difference between time and material and cost contracts.
Yeah. I think the time and material is a more difficult one this is my experience. It may not be industry experience, but it's a little more difficult to administer because you're not quite sure if those staff that you're augmenting your staff with are really putting in the time and materials that you expect of them.
Well,
so that's the part.
Yeah, and again, the risk is on the buyer for the cost increases because the time and materials resource, the seller, is going to make decisions. So here you are as a project manager. I have to monitor time cards. I have to monitor performance. They're an extra staff member. I have to do everything I do for them that I do my other staff. And if they're making purchase decisions, I need to approve that before they do that. So it brings a lot of complications and a little bit of risk to the project in that manner.
So we've talked a lot on this show about waterfall versus agile. Would you think that the cost plus would make more sense for agile?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what I recommend. I didn't know if I wanted to go there today, but I'm glad you brought that up because a fixed contract is great for traditional projects. With a cost contract, it's short, it's high level. I'm going to reimburse you, and here's the profit. And it allows for that flexibility in the work. And that's the beautiful thing. And so does the time and materials to a great extent. Yeah. Now, when you have a capped budget, you can actually cap that with the maximum price clause in a cost contract, or you can have a max cap price also in a time and material. So you still have flexibility under both those types of contracts. But yeah, you're exactly right. You can have agile projects very successfully under contracts.
So I think with that discussion, before we completely have our audience roll their eyes back in their heads, this was not meant to be a tutorial. I don't think it was, but it is an interesting discussion, I think, from a project manager's perspective as to the kinds of things that they should be watching out for and preparing for whenever they manage a project on behalf of their company and their customer.
And I want to say something, yeah. I'm only speaking as a project manager, as a business scientist. I'm an expert in business. Now, and get an attorney on this show, they're going to tell you their perspective. Get a purchasing agent on the show, they're going to say what they think is most important. But your job as a project manager is to take all their advice and bring it in such a way that it actually improves the project experience and it solidifies the success of the project.
You just tweaked something back in my memory. When I was doing advice of a client, of a customer, and this happened to be a government agency. Now, if you're familiar with government contracting, you contract with the department that needs the work done, but they have an independent procurement, not a division, probably a department that does all sorts of procurements for the entire government, not just this department. And it's interesting that in a situation where I advised the client where I, as a system integrator, would not bid on this with these kinds of owners' terms in it. They said we had to, because that's boilerplate. We actually went to the procurement department and had a discussion with them, and they tweaked the boilerplate to allow us to make the contract vehicle more amenable to a lot of the system integrators.
Wow.
We had to have done our homework. We had to have specified exactly the kinds of issues that we were running into. And they didn't change everything, but they did change some things. For example, have you ever heard of a clause called unlimited liability?
Uh-huh.
Yep. Who would bid into unlimited liability? Very few. But anyway, we changed a few things. The same kind of logic you use to manage the project, use that same kind of logic to deal with contracts and procurement.
And again, having somebody who's done this for a couple decades, who has this knowledge tacitly, is a real benefit if you're starting to get into this area. Your organization may or may not allow you to run on your own on contracts, but if you need to, or if you are allowed to, I would have a mentor at my hip and have them actually steer me as I'm going through this.
So if somebody in our audience wants to ask you more questions about this, Tim, where would that happen?
Over at LinkedIn. I'm still there. I'm still checking in with all of you. Thank you for reaching out. I appreciate all the comments, and I respond when I have time. And how about you, Merv?
Same thing. Love my LinkedIn, love my connections on LinkedIn. Sometimes I'm just an observer, kind of hanging out, looking to see what's going on. And sometimes I get involved in some really good discussions. And if the questions are directed towards me, I love getting into those discussions as well. We're not, we're not the be all and end all. And we never purported to be that whatever we say is exactly what you need to do. But all we can do is tell you what's worked for us and what hasn't worked for us from our experience.
Indeed. Indeed. Well, thanks again for a great conversation. And let's continue this. So thanks again, Merv, and looking forward to having another conversation with you.
Great, thanks.